On a cliff above the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by the grandest estates America has ever known, stands a palace that looks like it was stolen from the gardens of Versailles, Rosecliff. The name sounds gentle, but the story behind those white terracotta walls is anything but soft. From Bellevue Avenue, you see a mansion that glows like porcelain in certain light. Walk around to the ocean side and you discover a H-shaped palace embracing a sunken garden court that opens toward the water. Step through the bronze doors and you enter the third largest ballroom in Newport, Rhode Island, a room that once held 400 dancers spinning under a ceiling painted to look like open sky. The house cost over $2.5 million, 1902. That's roughly $90 million today. It required 200 craftsmen laboring for 4 years. It demanded European artisans, materials shipped across an ocean, and the kind of obsessive attention to detail that separates good architecture from transcendent beauty. The woman who built it was Theresa Fair Oelrichs, known as Tessie to everyone who mattered. She was the daughter of one of the richest and most ruthless men in America, a self-made silver baron who clawed his fortune from the Nevada desert. She married into New York society. She became one of the most celebrated hostesses of the Gilded Age, throwing parties that newspapers covered like coronations. And the palace she built to prove she belonged, the ballroom designed to make her unforgettable, became the symbol of everything that broke her. The weight of perfection crushed her. The cost of beauty consumed her. The dream of acceptance eluded her until the day she died. This is the story of Rosecliff, not just how it was built, but why it had to be built, and what it cost the woman who could not imagine life without it. If you love stories about Gilded Age excess, the palaces built by new money, and the women who shaped American high society, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments which Newport mansion we should explore next. The Breakers, Marble House, the Elms, or perhaps a forgotten estate with darker secrets? Your support makes these deep architectural investigations possible. Now, let's discover how one heiress tried to buy immortality with beauty. Chapter 1. The Silver King's Daughter. To understand why Tessie Fair spent a fortune building Rosecliff, you have to go back to the Nevada desert in the 1860s, to a place that looked like God's mistakes, rocks, dust, and heat that could kill a man by noon. The Comstock lode was discovered in 1859 near Virginia City, Nevada. It was the richest silver deposit ever found in the United States, a vein of ore so thick and so pure that it would eventually produce over $400 million worth of silver and gold. In today's currency, that's more than $12 billion pulled from a mountain that should have been worthless. James Graham Fair arrived in 1860. He was born in County Tyrone, Ireland, in 1831, and came to America as a boy with nothing but the clothes he wore and a willingness to work until his hands bled. He made his way west during the California Gold Rush, learning mining from the bottom up. While other men gambled on luck, Fair studied geology, ore samples, and the brutal mathematics of extraction. By 1867, Fair had formed a partnership with 3 other Irish immigrants, John Mackay, James Flood, and William O'Brien. History would call them the Bonanza Kings, though they earned that name later after they struck wealth so vast it bordered on obscene. They bought mining claims that other men had abandoned, convinced the silver was gone. Fair knew better. He understood that ore veins don't just stop, they shift, dive deeper, twist sideways. In 1873, they hit what became known as the Big Bonanza, the largest silver strike in American history. The ore came out of the ground in such volume that it crashed the global price of silver. Fair's personal fortune reached over $40 million by the 1880s, making him one of the 10 richest men in America. But wealth from the ground is different from wealth from railroads or banking. It comes fast, feels raw, and carries the smell of dynamite and sweat. East Coast society, the Astors, Vanderbilts, and Belmonts who controlled New York and Newport, looked down on mining fortunes as new money, dirty money, Western money. Fair didn't care about society. He cared about winning. He married Theresa Rooney in 1861, and they had 4 children. Theresa, called Tessie, born December 22, 1871. Virginia, called Bertie, born in 1875. And 2 sons, James Jr. and Charles. The marriage was a disaster. Fair was cold, controlling, and frequently absent. He spent months at a time in Virginia City, overseeing operations and accumulating wealth, while his wife and children lived in San Francisco. When he was home, he was distant and often cruel. Money poured in, but affection never came. In 1883, Theresa Fair did something almost unthinkable for a woman of her era. She filed for divorce. The proceedings were brutal and public. She accused him of adultery, cruelty, and abandonment. Newspapers across the country covered every detail. The scandal was enormous. The courts awarded her custody of the children and a financial settlement reported to be around $5 million as Fair barely fought her. He had won his fortune. The family was just another claim he'd exhausted. Tessie was 12 years old when her parents divorced. She was old enough to understand what it meant. Divorce was a scandal that stained everyone it touched. A divorced woman was damaged goods. The children of divorced parents carried a mark that society never let them forget. Tessie also carried her father's reputation. James Fair was brilliant and ruthless, but he was not refined. He cursed, drank, and made deals that left wreckage behind. To East Coast society, he represented everything they despised about Western wealth: loud, crude, and unpolished. Tessie grew up watching her mother fight for dignity in a world that whispered behind fans and closed doors. She learned that money alone wasn't enough. You needed the right address, the right friends, the right performance. You needed to make people forget where you came from. She was beautiful in an unconventional way. Dark hair, sharp, intelligent eyes, a presence that commanded attention rather than invited it. She was also brilliant, well-read, and determined to rise above the circumstances of her birth. When James Fair died in 1894, his fortune was divided among his 4 children. Tessie's share was estimated at between $10 and $15 million, roughly $350 million in today's money. She had the wealth. Now she needed the acceptance, and she knew exactly how to get it. Marry well, build beautifully, and throw parties so magnificent that no one would dare exclude her. Chapter 2. A Marriage of Ambition and Strategy. In the late 1880s, Tessie Fair moved to New York. San Francisco was comfortable, but New York was where American society was forged and tested. The great families, Astors, Vanderbilts, Belmonts, made their decisions in Manhattan ballrooms and Newport cottages. If you wanted to matter, you went to New York. Tessie rented a house on the Upper East Side and began the careful work of making connections. She attended the right parties, hired the right dressmakers, and cultivated friendships with women who had what she lacked: pedigree. In 1889, she met Hermann Oelrichs at a dinner party. He was 31, handsome in a serious way, and came from an established New York family with German roots. His family owned a partnership in the North German Lloyd steamship line, one of the largest shipping companies in the world. The Oelrichs name opened doors that Tessie's silver could not buy on its own. Hermann was charming, well-educated, and comfortable navigating the complex rules of high society. He understood who mattered and who didn't, which families were rising and which were declining, and how to position yourself for maximum advantage. He was also practical enough to recognize that Tessie's fortune could fund a lifestyle his family name could only introduce. They courted for a year. It was not a love match in the romantic sense, but it was a partnership built on mutual understanding. Hermann would give Tessie the social standing she craved. Tessie would give Hermann the financial freedom to live like the aristocrat his family name suggested he was. On May 6, 1890, they married at Grace Church in New York. Tessie was 18, Hermann was 32. The wedding was covered extensively in the newspapers, with reporters noting that the bride wore a dress imported from Paris and that the guest list included some of the most prominent families in New York. The marriage worked, at least in the beginning. Hermann genuinely liked Tessie. He admired her intelligence and respected her ambition. She was not content to simply be a wife. She wanted to build something, to create a name that would outlast the whispers about her father's rough manners and her mother's divorce. They had 2 children, Hermann Oelrichs Jr., born in 1891, and Theresa Alice Oelrichs, called Little Tessie, born in 1893. The family split their time between a limestone mansion on East 57th Street in Manhattan and summer rentals in Newport. Newport was the testing ground. Every summer from June through September, America's wealthiest families gathered on this small island off the coast of Rhode Island. They built massive cottages, a deliberately ironic term for houses that rivaled European palaces. They threw elaborate parties, sailed expensive yachts, and reinforced the social hierarchy through a complex system of invitations, exclusions, and carefully orchestrated public appearances. The competition was fierce and unforgiving. The Vanderbilts had the Breakers, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace designed by Richard Morris Hunt. Alva Vanderbilt had built Marble House, a monument to her ambition wrapped in $7 million worth of marble and gold leaf. The Astors had Beechwood. The Belmonts had Belcourt Castle. For the first few years, Tessie and Hermann rented houses in Newport. They attended parties but did not host them. They were invited to some events but excluded from others. Tessie could feel the invisible lines drawn around her. Not quite rejected, but not quite accepted. She understood the problem. Renting was temporary. Renting suggested you might not return. To truly belong in Newport, you needed your own cottage. You needed a stage of your own, a palace that announced you had arrived and had no intention of leaving. By 1897, Tessie and Hermann had decided they would build not just a summer house, but a palace that would rival anything on Bellevue Avenue, a place so beautiful, so perfect, that no one could ignore it, a ballroom so grand that invitations to their parties would become the most coveted in Newport. Tessie had watched her father fight his way to wealth through sheer determination. She had watched her mother fight for dignity through the courts. Now it was her turn to fight for acceptance, and her weapon would be beauty itself. They purchased a plot of land on Bellevue Avenue for $50,000, roughly $1.8 million today. The property was large, nearly 10 acres, with sweeping views of the Atlantic Ocean. It was not the most prominent site on the avenue, but it was good enough. What mattered was what they would build on it. Tessie knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted a palace that looked European, refined, and timeless. She wanted a ballroom larger than any private ballroom in Newport. She wanted a place where she could host parties that would be remembered for generations, and she knew exactly who could design it. Stanford White, the most famous, most talented, and most dangerous architect in America. Chapter 3. Stanford White and the Dream of Versailles. Stanford White was 44 years old when Tessie hired him in 1898. He was at the absolute peak of his career and his fame, a celebrity architect whose buildings shaped the skyline of New York and whose personal life generated as many headlines as his designs. White was a partner in McKim, Mead & White, the most prestigious architectural firm in the United States. The firm had designed the Boston Public Library, the Washington Square Arch, Columbia University's original campus, and dozens of mansions for families with names like Astor, Whitney, and Vanderbilt. When you hired McKim, Mead & White, you were making a statement. When you got Stanford White personally, you had arrived. White was a large man with red hair, a thick mustache, and an appetite for everything: food, wine, women, art, and architecture. He loved excess and drama. He loved color and ornament and theatrical gestures. He was charming, charismatic, and utterly brilliant. He was also reckless, self-destructive, and would eventually die in one of the most scandalous murders of the 20th century. But in 1898, all of that was ahead of him. He was simply the man who could turn Tessie's ambitions into stone and terra cotta. Their first meeting took place in White's office at 165th Avenue in Manhattan. Tessie arrived with sketches, photographs, and a clear vision. She told White she wanted a palace inspired by Versailles, but adapted for American summers. She wanted open space, light, and air. She wanted a ballroom that could hold 400 people. She wanted perfection. White listened carefully. He asked questions about how she planned to use the house, how many guests she expected to entertain, and what kind of staff she would employ. He understood that architecture was not just about beauty. It was about function, flow, and the psychology of space. Then he showed her images of the Grand Trianon. The Grand Trianon was built by Louis XIV in 1687 on the grounds of Versailles. It was designed by architect Jules Ardouin Mansart as a private retreat where the king could escape the suffocating formality of the main palace. The Trianon was a single-story structure made of pink marble and white stone, with tall windows, a flat roofline, and a garden court at its center. It was elegant, symmetrical, and serene. White proposed adapting the Trianon's design for Newport's needs. He would make the mansion 2 stories instead of 1, adding private family bedrooms and guest rooms on the 2nd floor. He would use white glazed terracotta instead of marble to reduce costs and construction time. He would design the building in an H shape, with 2 wings flanking a central block that would house the ballroom. The exterior would be deceptively simple: smooth white walls, tall windows with delicate iron balconies, and a low balustrade along the roofline. From a distance, the house would look almost modest, even serene. Up close, the scale would overwhelm. The doors were 12 feet tall. The windows were 10 feet high. The walls rose 30 feet without a break. White sketched the approach as he talked. Visitors would enter from Bellevue Avenue through ornate iron gates. They would cross a gravel courtyard flanked by low hedges and stone urns. They would climb a shallow set of marble steps to the front entrance, where bronze doors would open into a marble-floored entrance hall. But the real drama was on the ocean side. There, White designed a sunken garden court surrounded by the H-shaped wings of the house. The court would be paved with white stone and edged with formal gardens. At the far end, a stone balustrade would overlook the Atlantic. On summer evenings, the court could be used for outdoor entertaining: cocktails before dinner, dessert after dancing, with the ocean as backdrop and the house as frame. Inside, White focused all his genius on the ballroom. It would measure 80 feet long, 40 feet wide, and 30 feet high, roughly 96,000 cubic feet of space. The floor would be made of polished oak laid in a herringbone pattern. The walls would be covered in cream-colored stucco with delicate plasterwork moldings that suggested leaves, vines, and flowers without ever becoming busy or overwhelming. At one end of the ballroom, White designed a musician's gallery, a raised platform where an orchestra could play without taking up valuable dance floor space. The gallery would be supported by elegant columns and accessed by a hidden staircase from the service areas below. The ceiling was White's masterpiece. He commissioned artist Robert Reed to paint a trompe-l'oeil sky, a technique that creates the illusion of 3-dimensional space on a flat surface. Reed would paint soft blue sky with wispy white clouds drifting across the expanse. From the dance floor, it would look as though the roof had simply disappeared, leaving dancers waltzing under heaven itself. White also designed a grand staircase that would sweep upward from the entrance hall to the 2nd floor. The steps would be white marble with gray veining, quarried from Vermont. The banister would be bronze and wrought iron, cast in France and assembled on site. The staircase would be wide enough for a woman in a ball gown, with a 6-foot train to descend without her dress brushing the walls. The other rooms were smaller and more intimate. The library would be paneled in dark mahogany, with built-in bookshelves reaching 12 feet high. The drawing room would feature French furniture upholstered in silk, walls covered in hand-painted wallpaper from Paris, and windows dressed in velvet curtains that pooled on the floor. The dining room could seat 24 at a table made of walnut with mother-of-pearl inlay. White positioned the room to catch morning light from the east so breakfast would feel bright and optimistic. Crystal chandeliers would provide evening light, reflected and multiplied by mirrors set into the wall panels. Upstairs, the bedrooms were decorated in soft pastels, pale blues, shell pinks, cream yellows. Tessie's suite overlooked the ocean with a private sitting room and dressing room attached. Hermann's suite was adjacent, connected by a shared sitting room but with separate entrances to maintain privacy. Guest bedrooms lined the hallways, each with its own bathroom, a modern luxury that most Newport cottages still lacked. The house was designed for entertaining, not for family life. There was no large family dining room, no children's playroom, no cozy den for quiet evenings. Every space was calculated to impress guests and showcase Tessie's taste and wealth. White worked closely with Tessie on every detail. She had strong opinions about proportion, color, and light. She wanted the house to feel open and airy, not dark and heavy like so many Victorian mansions. She wanted guests to feel as though they were stepping into a French palace, not an American imitation. White respected her vision but also knew how to manage her expectations. When she asked for gold leaf on the ballroom ceiling, he suggested cream paint instead, arguing that gold would feel heavy and would compete with the painted sky. When she wanted more guest bedrooms, he reminded her that the house was designed for parties, not for housing extended family for long stays. She usually deferred to his judgment. By the time the plans were finalized in late 1898, the estimated cost had reached $1.5 million for construction alone, roughly $54 million today. That figure did not include the land, the furnishings, the landscaping, or the annual operating costs. Tessie signed the contracts without hesitation. She had her father's silver. She had her husband's support. And she had the most famous architect in America designing her dream. Construction would begin in the spring of 1899. Chapter 4. 200 Workers in White Terracotta Building. Rosecliff required an army. Over 200 workers labored on the site for nearly 4 years. Stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, painters, ironworkers, glaziers, and laborers worked 6 days a week, often from sunrise until dusk during the summer months when the light lasted longest. The first challenge was the foundation. Newport sits on bedrock, hard New England granite that resists digging but provides excellent support once excavated. Workers used dynamite to blast through the hardest sections, then hauled away the rubble by horse-drawn wagon. The excavation took 3 months and left a hole 20 feet deep at its lowest point. Once the site was level and cleared, concrete was poured for the foundation walls. The concrete was mixed on site using sand brought from inland quarries, Portland cement shipped from manufacturers in New York, and clean water pumped from a well drilled specifically for construction. The foundation walls were 4 feet thick at the base, tapering to 2 feet thick at ground level. The foundation was designed not just to support the house, but to resist moisture from the ocean air. Workers installed drainage systems around the perimeter, terracotta pipes that would channel groundwater away from the foundation and prevent the basement from flooding during storms. By summer 1899, the foundation was complete and the steel frame began to rise. White had designed Rosecliff to be fireproof, a lesson learned from too many mansion fires that had destroyed irreplaceable architecture and art. The structural frame was steel, massive I-beams bolted together and anchored deep into the foundation. The walls were steel and brick, then covered with white glazed terracotta panels that looked like stone but weighed far less. Terracotta was a relatively new building material in 1899. It was made by pressing clay into molds, letting it dry partially, then firing it in kilns at extremely high temperatures. The heat transformed the clay into a hard, durable material that could be glazed to create a smooth, waterproof surface. White used terracotta because it was cheaper than marble, easier to shape, lighter to transport and install, and durable enough to withstand Newport's harsh coastal weather. The panels were manufactured by the Atlantic Terracotta Company in Staten Island, New York. White worked directly with the company's designers to create molds for each panel type. The panels varied in size. Some were simple rectangles. Others were ornamental pieces with carved details that suggested classical moldings. Each panel was cast individually, glazed in a soft white color, and fired. The finished panels were shipped by boat to Newport, arriving on barges that docked at the nearby wharf. Workers loaded the panels onto wagons and hauled them to the construction site, where they were stored under canvas tarps to protect them from weather and damage. Installing the terracotta required precision. Each panel had to fit exactly against its neighbors to create seamless walls. Workers spread mortar on the back of each panel, pressed it into place against the steel and brick frame, then used wooden braces to hold it steady until the mortar cured. The joints between panels were filled with more mortar, then carefully smoothed to make them invisible. By spring 1900, the exterior walls were largely complete. The house was beginning to take shape, and from Bellevue Avenue, it looked like a white jewel set against the green lawn and blue sky. The terracotta glowed in sunlight, softened in evening light, and seemed to float above the ground in morning fog. Inside, the work was even more complex. The ballroom presented the greatest structural challenge. White needed a ceiling that could span 80 feet without visible support columns. Interior columns would ruin the flow of the dance floor and make the room feel choppy and broken. White solved the problem with hidden steel trusses. Above the ballroom ceiling, concealed in the attic space, workers installed massive trusses that spanned the entire width of the room. These trusses distributed the weight of the roof across the exterior walls, leaving the ballroom interior completely open. The ceiling itself was made of lath and plaster. Workers first nailed thin wooden strips, lath, to the underside of the trusses, creating a lattice. Then plasterers applied layer after layer of wet plaster, building up a smooth surface about 2 inches thick. The plaster had to cure slowly and evenly to prevent cracking. The process took months. Once the plaster was fully cured, artist Robert Reed arrived to paint the ceiling. Reed was a member of the 10 American Painters, a group of American Impressionists who had broken away from the Society of American Artists to pursue a more personal, less academic style. Reed specialized in murals and had painted ceilings for several important buildings, including the Library of Congress. For Rosecliff, Reed designed a sky painted in the trompe-l'oeil technique. He worked from scaffolding erected in the center of the ballroom, painting directly onto the plaster ceiling. The sky he created was soft blue with wispy white clouds that seemed to drift across the expanse. The clouds were not fluffy and defined like photographs. They were impressionistic, suggested rather than detailed. The effect was subtle and dreamy, as though the roof had been removed to reveal a perfect summer day. Reed spent 6 weeks on the scaffolding, working mostly in the mornings, when the natural light was best. When he finished, workers removed the scaffolding, and the ballroom ceiling seemed to open to infinity. The floors throughout the house were laid by hand. The ballroom floor was the most important and the most challenging. White specified white oak planks, each 12 inches wide and 16 feet long. The wood came from old-growth forests in Pennsylvania, where trees grew slowly and produced tight-grained lumber that would not warp or split. The planks were laid in a herringbone pattern, a zigzag design that required each plank to be cut at precise angles and fitted against its neighbors. Workers spent 3 months laying the ballroom floor, checking each plank for level and adjusting as needed. Once all the planks were in place, the floor was sanded smooth, using progressively finer grades of sandpaper, then finished with multiple coats of wax that were hand-buffed to a mirror shine. The grand staircase was built off-site and assembled on location. The marble steps came from the Danby Quarry in Vermont, famous for producing pure white marble with delicate gray veining. Each step was cut to exact specifications, numbered, and shipped by rail to Newport. The bronze and wrought iron railing was cast at a foundry in New York, where craftsmen created molds based on White's drawings. The railing featured delicate scrollwork and botanical motifs, vines, leaves, and flowers that seemed to grow organically from the metal. Installing the staircase took 3 weeks. Workers used wooden braces and pulleys to lift each marble step into place, setting them on steel supports embedded in the walls. The bronze railing was bolted to the steps and the wall, then polished until it gleamed. When the work was finished, the staircase seemed to float upward in a graceful curve, inviting guests to ascend to the private rooms above. White insisted on modern systems throughout the house. Rosecliff was wired for electricity from the beginning, with light switches in every major room and electric chandeliers in the ballroom, dining room, and entrance hall. The electrical system was designed by experts from General Electric and featured wires insulated with cloth and rubber, run through the walls in metal conduits to prevent fires. The house also had central heating, a luxury that many Newport cottages still lacked. A coal-fired boiler in the basement sent steam through pipes hidden in the walls and floors. Cast iron radiators in each room released heat quietly and efficiently. Tessie insisted that guests should never be cold, even during the chilly evenings of early summer or late September. The plumbing system was equally sophisticated. Copper pipes carried water from a well on the property to bathrooms on both floors. Each bathroom featured porcelain fixtures, toilets, sinks, and bathtubs imported from England. Hot water was provided by a separate boiler system that kept a large tank heated at all times. Tessie could draw a hot bath at any hour without waiting for water to heat. By late 1901, the exterior was finished, the ballroom was complete, and the interior rooms were being plastered, painted, and fitted with woodwork. By mid-1902, furniture was arriving. Pieces ordered from Paris, London, and New York, each chosen by Tessie and Stanford White to complement the rooms they would occupy. The final cost exceeded $2.5 million, roughly $90 million today. That figure included the construction, the furnishings, and the initial landscaping, but it did not include the land or the ongoing operating costs. Tessie paid every invoice without hesitation. She had bet her father's silver on this house, and she was determined to win. In August 1902, Rosecliff was finished. The house stood on Bellevue Avenue like a vision from another world, white, elegant, and waiting to be filled with life. Chapter 5. The Ballroom That Launched a Legend. Tessie Oelrichs needed only one thing now that Rosecliff was complete: an audience. She had built the stage. Now it was time to perform. Her first major event was a dinner dance in August 1902, just weeks after the house was finished. She invited 200 guests, carefully chosen to include the most important families in Newport society: the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Belmonts, the Gilded, the Burdens. Every name that mattered received an engraved invitation on heavy cream card stock. The evening began at 8 o'clock. Guests arrived in carriages that lined up along Bellevue Avenue. Depositing women in silk gowns and men in white tie and tails, they passed through the iron gates, crossed the gravel courtyard, and climbed the marble steps to the front entrance, where footmen in livery opened the bronze doors. Inside, the entrance hall gleamed with electric light. The marble floor reflected the glow from crystal chandeliers. Fresh flowers, roses, lilies, orchids, filled vases placed on console tables along the walls. The air smelled of flowers and expensive perfume. Tessie stood at the base of the grand staircase, greeting each guest personally. She wore a gown made by the House of Worth in Paris, white silk embroidered with seed pearls, with a train that trailed 6 feet behind her. Her dark hair was swept up and adorned with diamond pins. She looked like what she had always wanted to be: a queen receiving her court. After greetings, guests were directed to the garden court for cocktails. The August evening was warm and soft. Small tables were arranged around the courtyard, lit by lanterns that cast golden light across the white stone pavement. Waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. At 9 o'clock, guests moved to the dining room. The table seated 24, so dinner was served in multiple sittings. Each course was prepared by a French chef Tessie had hired for the season: oysters, consommé, fish, sorbet to cleanse the palate, roasted duck, vegetables, salad, cheese, and finally dessert, a towering confection of spun sugar and cream. At 11 o'clock, the ballroom doors opened. The effect was breathtaking. The room glowed with the light of 2 massive crystal chandeliers. The polished oak floor gleamed like water. The ceiling seemed to disappear into an endless sky. The orchestra, 30 musicians positioned in the gallery, began playing a Strauss waltz. Guests flooded onto the dance floor. Women's gowns swirled in patterns of silk and satin. Men guided their partners through the formal steps of the waltz, their movements synchronized to the music. The sound of violins, the rustle of fabric, the soft click of heels on wood, it all blended into a perfect moment that Tessie had spent years and millions of dollars creating. She stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching. Hermann was beside her, smiling and nodding to friends. For that one evening, everything she had fought for seemed worth it. She had built a palace. She had filled it with the most important people in America. She had proven that a girl from the Nevada silver camps could command the same respect as families whose names went back generations. The next morning, the New York Times ran a story praising the elegance of the event and the beauty of Rosecliff. The Newport Daily News declared it the social triumph of the season. Columnists who shaped public opinion, women like Maud Howe Elliott and Elizabeth Drexel Lair, wrote that Theresa Oelrichs had taken her place among the great hostesses of the Gilded Age. But one party was not enough. In the strange, competitive world of Newport society, you were only as good as your last event. Tessie needed to keep surprising, keep innovating, keep spending. In 1904, she threw the party that would define her reputation forever. The Bal Blanc, also known as the White Ball. The concept was simple. Everything would be white. Decorations, flowers, food, clothing. All white, all perfect, all expensive beyond reason. Tessie hired a team of florists who worked for 3 days transforming the ballroom. They covered every surface with white flowers. Roses, orchids, lilies, hydrangeas, arranged in massive displays that reached from floor to ceiling. The chandeliers were wrapped in white silk. The chairs were draped in white linen. Even the orchestra wore white. Guests were required to dress entirely in white. No exceptions. Women wore gowns of white satin, silk, chiffon, and lace, many designed specifically for the event by Worth, Paquin, and other Paris couturiers. Men wore white tie and tails. The effect was ghostly and beautiful, like a gathering of spirits in a snow palace. Tessie wore a gown that cost $10,000, roughly $350,000 today. White chiffon embroidered with seed pearls in patterns that caught the light with every movement. She wore diamonds at her throat, diamonds in her hair, diamonds on her wrists. The food was white. White asparagus soup, poached fish in cream sauce, chicken in white wine, vanilla ice cream, meringues, white chocolate. Even the champagne was chosen for its pale color. The ball lasted until dawn. 400 guests danced, ate, drank, and talked under the white bower of flowers. The cost was estimated at over $200,000, roughly $7 million today. Newspapers across the country covered the white ball. Photographs appeared in Harper's Bazaar and Vogue. Society columnists declared it the most elaborate party Newport had ever seen, surpassing even the legendary balls thrown by Alva Vanderbilt at Marble House. Tessie had won. She had proven that new money, properly deployed, could compete with old money on equal terms. She had shown that taste and ambition could overcome the stain of her father's rough manners and her parents' divorce. But winning required constant effort. She could not simply rest on her success. The moment she stopped innovating, someone else would take her place. Over the next decade, Tessie threw dozens of parties at Rosecliff. She hosted garden luncheons, intimate dinners, costume balls, and charity benefits. Each event required weeks of planning, thousands of dollars in expenses, and flawless execution. She became known for her creativity and her willingness to break conventions. In 1905, she threw a luncheon where the tables were arranged in a horseshoe shape on the lawn, with each place setting featuring a different type of flower. In 1907, she hosted a fête champêtre, a country festival where guests dressed as shepherds and shepherdesses and played games on the lawn. In 1909, she threw a party where the ballroom was transformed into a circus tent, complete with trained dogs, acrobats, and a fortune teller reading palms in the corner. She hired the best entertainers, ordered the most expensive flowers, served the finest champagne. She controlled every detail, the lighting, the music, the timing of each course, the arrangement of the tables. Her parties were performances, and she was the director, producer, and star. But performances require an audience, and audiences grow tired. By 1910, the novelty was wearing off. The competition had caught up. Other hostesses were throwing equally elaborate parties. The standards Tessie had set now worked against her. She had trained society to expect perfection, and perfection is expensive, exhausting, and ultimately unsustainable. Chapter 6. The Golden Summers. The Newport season ran from June through September, but the preparation began in March. That's when Tessie would start hiring staff, ordering flowers, planning menus, and sending out invitations for the season's events. Running Rosecliff required a full-time staff of over 30 people during the summer months. The household was organized like a small corporation, with clear hierarchies and specific responsibilities. At the top was the butler, who managed the male staff and oversaw all formal service. He earned approximately $1,500 per year, roughly $54,000 today, making him one of the highest-paid employees. Below him were footmen who served at table, answered doors, and assisted guests. Each footman earned about $600 per year. The housekeeper managed the female staff and oversaw cleaning, laundry, and the maintenance of linens and furnishings. She earned about $1,000 per year. Below her were maids, upstairs maids who cleaned the family and guest bedrooms. downstairs maids who cleaned the public rooms, and laundry maids who washed, ironed, and mended linens and clothing. The chef commanded the kitchen with military precision. He earned $2,000 per year and had complete authority over menus, purchasing, and kitchen operations. Below him were sous chefs, pastry chefs, and kitchen assistants who prepared the elaborate meals required for Tessie's entertaining. Outside, the grounds required a team of gardeners who maintained the lawns, pruned the hedges, planted seasonal flowers, and kept the garden court looking pristine. The head gardener earned about $1,200 per year and supervised a team of 4 to 6 assistants. There were also coachmen, stable hands, and later chauffeurs who maintained the carriages and eventually the automobiles. There were night watchmen who patrolled the property. There were seamstresses who mended clothing and made minor alterations. The weekly payroll during the summer season exceeded $2,000, roughly $72,000 in today's money. That's over $10,000 per week, and that was just wages. Add food for the staff, uniforms, supplies, coal for heating, electricity, water, and maintenance, and the operating costs reached approximately $150,000 per year, roughly $5.4 million today. Tessie also spent enormous sums on flowers. During the summer season, fresh flowers were delivered daily from greenhouses in Providence. Roses, orchids, lilies, and seasonal blooms filled vases throughout the house. For major parties, the flower budget alone could reach $5,000, roughly $180,000 today. The food costs were equally staggering. Tessie insisted on the finest ingredients: oysters from Long Island, fish from local waters, beef from the best suppliers, vegetables and fruits shipped from specialized farms. Champagne, wine, and spirits were ordered by the case from importers in New York. A single dinner party for 50 guests could cost $3,000 in food and wine alone. And then there was the wear and tear on the house itself. The ballroom floor had to be refinished annually. The terracotta exterior needed cleaning to remove salt deposits from the ocean air. The plumbing required regular maintenance. Windows broke in storms and had to be replaced. The roof developed leaks that needed repair. Stanford White had designed a beautiful house, but beauty requires constant care. Rosecliff was not a home that could simply exist. It demanded attention, money, and labor every single day. Tessie managed all of it personally. She reviewed the weekly accounts, approved major purchases, and made decisions about maintenance and repairs. Hermann helped with the business side, managing investments, maintaining the shipping company interests, and handling legal matters. But Tessie ran the household. The pressure was enormous. Every detail had to be perfect. Every party had to exceed expectations. Every interaction with society had to be carefully managed. There was no room for mistakes, no tolerance for failure, and the competition never stopped. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont continued throwing elaborate parties at Marble House. Mamie Fish entertained with wit and irreverence at her cottage. Younger hostesses were rising, bringing new ideas and fresh energy. Tessie also faced challenges in her personal life. Her marriage to Hermann, which had started as a strategic partnership, was showing strain. Hermann enjoyed the social life, but found the constant entertaining exhausting. He preferred quiet dinners with close friends to grand balls with hundreds of guests. There were also rumors, never confirmed but persistent, that Hermann had romantic interests outside the marriage. Society gossip was cruel and often unfounded, but the whispers were there, adding to Tessie's stress. Her health began to suffer. She developed chronic headaches and insomnia. Doctors diagnosed nervous exhaustion and prescribed rest, but rest was impossible during the Newport season. She relied on tonics and medications that likely contained opium or cocaine, both legal and commonly prescribed at the time for women's complaints. Despite these challenges, Tessie continued to perform. She believed that stopping would mean losing ground, and losing ground would mean admitting that her father's silver could not buy her a permanent place in society. The summers at Rosecliff from 1902 to 1914 represented the peak of Gilded Age excess. The parties were legendary. The guest lists included everyone who mattered. The house itself became one of the most photographed and discussed properties in America. But beneath the glamour, the foundation was cracking. The endless spending, the constant pressure, the exhausting performance, it was all taking a toll that Tessie could not afford to acknowledge. Chapter 7. The Weight of Beauty. By 1914, the world was changing in ways that made Rosecliff and everything it represented feel increasingly outdated. In Europe, tensions were rising. In August, war broke out. The United States remained neutral, but the conflict cast a shadow over everything, including Newport's summer season. Lavish parties suddenly felt inappropriate. Hostesses who had competed to throw the most elaborate events now competed to appear the most restrained. Tessie tried to adapt, hosting smaller dinners and charity benefits for war relief, but her heart wasn't in it. She had built Rosecliff for glamour, not charity. Hermann's health was also declining. He had suffered from heart problems for years, and doctors warned that stress was making them worse. The shipping business faced challenges. German U-boats were attacking merchant vessels, and insurance costs were skyrocketing. Profits that had once seemed endless were shrinking. The couple spent less time together. Hermann increasingly preferred their New York townhouse, where he could focus on business without the social obligations of Newport. Tessie spent more time in Europe, traveling to Paris and London, seeking distraction from her growing unhappiness. The children were grown and pursuing their own lives. Hermann Jr. had graduated from Yale and was working in the family business. Little Tessie was preparing for her society debut. Both children had been raised in wealth and privilege, but they lacked their mother's driving ambition. They took their advantages for granted in a way that frustrated Tessie. In 1917, the United States entered World War I. The Newport season was subdued, almost mournful. Many of the young men who had attended Tessie's parties were now in uniform, preparing to ship overseas. Several would not return. Tessie tried to contribute to the war effort. She opened Rosecliff for fundraising events and benefits. She donated money to the Red Cross and other relief organizations. But these activities felt hollow. She had spent nearly 2 decades building her reputation as the greatest hostess in Newport, and now no one wanted parties. Hermann's health continued to deteriorate. In early 1918, he suffered a serious heart attack. Doctors advised complete rest and warned that another attack could be fatal. Tessie did her best to care for him, but she was not a natural caregiver. She was impatient with illness and uncomfortable with the vulnerability it revealed. In September 1918, as the influenza pandemic swept across the United States, Hermann contracted the flu. His weakened heart could not fight the infection. He died at Rosecliff on September 1, 1918. He was 57 years old. Tessie was devastated. Despite the strain in their marriage, Hermann had been her partner for 28 years. He had given her the social standing she needed to build Rosecliff and establish herself in Newport. He had supported her ambitions, tolerated her excesses, and never questioned the enormous sums she spent on parties and perfection. Without him, she felt unmoored. The funeral was held at Rosecliff. Friends and family gathered in the ballroom, the same room where so many celebrations had taken place. The contrast was unbearable. The space that had once held 400 dancers now held a casket and grieving family members. The room that had been designed for joy now echoed with sorrow. After Hermann's death, Tessie tried to maintain some semblance of her former life. She opened Rosecliff for the 1919 summer season, but her heart wasn't in it. She hosted a few small dinners, but the grand balls were over. The house felt too large, too empty, too full of memories. The operating costs had not decreased. The staff still needed wages. The house still required maintenance. The gardens still needed care. She was spending over $100,000 a year, roughly $1.7 million today, on a house she barely used. Her own health was failing. Years of stress, insomnia, and reliance on medications had taken their toll. She suffered from chronic headaches, anxiety, and what doctors at the time called neurasthenia, a vague diagnosis that covered a range of nervous system complaints, including depression, fatigue, and emotional instability. Doctors prescribed rest, travel, and reduced stress. Tessie tried to follow their advice. She spent winters in Europe, traveling to the French Riviera, where the climate was mild and the social scene less demanding than Newport's. But she could not escape her own mind. She had spent her entire adult life fighting for acceptance, building beauty, throwing parties, and trying to prove that she belonged. Now in her 50s, she was exhausted, widowed, and increasingly isolated. In the spring of 1926, while traveling in Europe, Tessie suffered a stroke. She was 54 years old. The stroke left her partially paralyzed on her left side and affected her speech. She could understand what people said, but forming words was difficult and frustrating. She returned to the United States for treatment, staying at the family's townhouse on East 57th Street in Manhattan. Her children visited regularly, but there was little they could do. Stroke treatment in 1926 was primitive: rest, massage, and hope that the body would heal itself. Tessie's condition did not improve. She remained partially paralyzed and struggled to communicate. She spent her days in a wheelchair, attended by nurses looking out the window at a city that had moved on without her. On November 22, 1926, Theresa Fair Oelrichs died. She was 54 years old. The cause of death was listed as complications from the stroke. The obituaries were respectful and thorough. The New York Times remembered her as one of the great hostesses of the Gilded Age and described Rosecliff as one of the most beautiful estates in Newport. Society columnists praised her taste, her generosity, and her legendary parties. But they also noted the sadness of her later years. She had spent a fortune. Estimates ranged from $5 to $10 million over her lifetime, roughly $175 million in today's money, to secure her place in history. She had built a palace that rivaled Versailles. She had thrown parties that defined an era. And in the end, she died alone in a New York townhouse, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to return to the ballroom where she had once reigned as queen. Chapter 8. The Empty Palace. After Tessie's death, Rosecliff became a problem that no one wanted to solve. The house passed to her children, Hermann Jr. and Theresa Alice, who had no interest in living there. Neither had inherited their mother's obsession with Newport society. They had their own homes, their own lives, their own priorities. They tried to sell the house, but finding a buyer during the Great Depression was nearly impossible. The stock market had crashed in 1929, wiping out fortunes overnight. The families who might once have been able to afford Rosecliff were now struggling to maintain their own estates. The Newport real estate market had collapsed. The grand cottages that had symbolized Gilded Age excess were now seen as burdens, expensive to maintain, impossible to heat, requiring armies of servants that no one could afford. Several of the great Newport mansions were demolished in the 1930s and 1940s. The land was worth more than the buildings. Developers bought estates, tore down the houses, and subdivided the property for smaller homes. Rosecliff survived, but barely. Hermann Jr. and Theresa Alice struggled to find buyers, lessees, or any arrangement that would relieve them of the financial burden. In 1941, they finally found a buyer, Gertrude Niesen, a Broadway actress and singer who had found success on the stage and in radio. Niesen purchased Rosecliff for $21,000, roughly $450,000 in today's money. It was a tiny fraction of what Tessie had spent to build it, but the Oelrichs children were grateful to be free of the expense. Niesen had grand plans. She hoped to turn Rosecliff into a nightclub or event venue, capitalizing on its famous ballroom and Newport location. But her plans never materialized. Operating costs were still enormous, and the post-war economy had not fully recovered. She lived in the house briefly, hosting a few parties and entertaining friends, but found it too expensive to maintain. She leased it to various tenants over the years, but none stayed long. The house was simply too large, too expensive, and too formal for modern living. By the 1950s, Rosecliff was in visible decline. The gleaming white terracotta panels had stained and cracked. Salt air from the ocean had corroded ironwork and damaged paint. The roof leaked in several places, causing water damage to the ceiling of the ballroom. The famous painted sky was discolored and peeling. The gardens had gone wild. Hedges grew unpruned. Flower beds turned to weeds. The lawn, once manicured like a golf course, was patchy and overgrown. Inside, the house felt abandoned. Furniture was covered in dust sheets. Chandeliers hung dark. The ballroom floor, once polished to a mirror shine, was scuffed and warped. The grand staircase's bronze railing had tarnished. The house that had once represented the pinnacle of American wealth and taste now looked like a relic from a vanished world, beautiful from a distance, tragic up close. In 1963, a couple named J. Edgar Monroe and Ray Allen Van Cleef purchased Rosecliff. They were preservationists who recognized the house's architectural and historical significance. They invested their own money in emergency repairs, replacing sections of the roof, stabilizing the foundation, and securing the building against further weather damage. They also began opening Rosecliff for public tours, charging admission and using the revenue to fund restoration work. It was a bold move. Newport had a few house museums by the 1960s, but opening private homes to the public was still relatively unusual. The public responded enthusiastically. Thousands of visitors came each summer to walk through the ballroom where Tessie had thrown her legendary parties, to climb the grand staircase, and to stand in the garden court overlooking the ocean. But Monroe and Van Cleef lacked the resources to complete a full restoration. The work required was overwhelming. Millions of dollars in repairs, specialized craftsmen, years of patient labor. By 1971, facing mounting costs and unable to continue on their own, they made a difficult decision. They donated Rosecliff to the Preservation Society of Newport County. Chapter 9. Saving Beauty from Itself. The Preservation Society of Newport County was founded in 1945 to save the breakers from demolition. Over the following decades, the Society had acquired several other Newport mansions, operating them as museums and using admission fees to fund preservation. When the Society accepted Rosecliff in 1971, they inherited a building in crisis. The structural problems were serious, but not catastrophic. The terracotta exterior needed extensive cleaning, repair, and repointing. The roof required a complete replacement. The windows needed reglazing. The ballroom ceiling's painted sky was damaged and discolored. The Society hired specialists in historic preservation to assess the building and develop a restoration plan. Engineers examined the steel frame and found it sound. Stanford White's fireproof design had protected the structure from the worst damage. Architects studied original drawings, photographs, and documentation to understand White's design intent. The restoration philosophy was clear. Return Rosecliff to its appearance in 1902 when Tessie first opened the house for entertaining. Where original materials survived, they would be conserved and repaired. Where materials were missing or too damaged to save, exact replicas would be created using period-appropriate techniques and materials. The work began with the exterior. Craftsmen erected scaffolding around the entire house and began cleaning the terracotta panels one by one. Decades of dirt, pollution, and salt deposits had stained the white glaze. Workers used soft brushes, mild detergents, and lots of patience to clean each panel without damaging the glaze. Where panels were cracked or missing, new ones had to be made. The Society located a terracotta manufacturer who could replicate the original panels using the same clay composition and firing techniques. Molds were created from surviving panels, and new sections were cast, glazed, and fired. The color match was nearly perfect. Repointing the joints between panels was painstaking work. Workers mixed mortar to match the original composition, lime, sand, and cement, in specific proportions. Each joint was carefully cleaned, then filled with fresh mortar and smoothed to be nearly invisible. The roof replacement was a major undertaking. The original slate tiles were removed, numbered, and stored. Workers repaired or replaced damaged sections of the roof deck, installed new waterproofing, then reinstalled the slate tiles in their original positions. Where tiles were too damaged to reuse, new slate was quarried and cut to match. Inside, the ballroom ceiling required the most delicate work. Conservation specialists examined Robert Reed's painted sky and determined that much of the original paint could be saved. They cleaned the ceiling carefully, removing decades of dirt and smoke damage without disturbing the paint underneath. Where paint had flaked away, conservators used archival photographs to guide their restoration, matching colors and brushstrokes as closely as possible. The ballroom floor was stripped of old finish, sanded smooth, and refinished with multiple coats of modern polyurethane that provided durability while maintaining the warm glow of the original wax finish. The work took 3 months and required workers to wear soft shoes and step carefully to avoid marking the wood. The grand staircase's bronze railing was disassembled, each piece cleaned and polished by hand, then reassembled. The marble steps were cleaned with specialized solutions that removed stains without etching the stone. Throughout the house, damaged plasterwork was repaired by artisans trained in traditional techniques. They mixed plaster using period-appropriate recipes, shaped it by hand to match surviving moldings, then painted it to blend seamlessly with the original work. The Society, researched paint colors using microscopic analysis of paint layers on the walls. They discovered that Tessie's original color scheme was lighter and more subtle than later paint jobs had suggested. Rooms were repainted in soft creams, pale blues, and gentle yellows, colors that made the spaces feel airy and welcoming rather than dark and formal. Furnishing the house required extensive research. Most of Tessie's original furniture had been sold or lost over the decades. The Society used period photographs, inventory lists, and descriptions from newspaper accounts to identify appropriate replacements. They purchased period furniture from auctions and dealers, choosing pieces that matched the style and quality of what Tessie would have owned. The gardens were replanted following landscape plans from the early 1900s. Hedges were pruned back to proper proportions. Flower beds were restored with period-appropriate plantings. The lawn was reseeded and carefully maintained. The garden court once again looked like a formal French garden, ordered and elegant. The restoration took nearly 15 years of continuous work. Funding came from admission fees, private donations, grants from historic preservation organizations, and fundraising events. The Society spent approximately $6 million, roughly $20 million in today's money, on the restoration. By the mid-1980s, Rosecliff had been returned to something very close to its appearance when Tessie first opened the house in 1902. The ballroom gleamed. The terracotta glowed white in sunlight. The gardens bloomed. The grand staircase shone. The house that had nearly been lost was now one of the most visited historic sites in Newport. Chapter 10. A Palace for the People. Today, Rosecliff stands on Bellevue Avenue, much as it did when Stanford White finished it in 1902. The white terracotta still glows in sunlight. The garden court still overlooks the Atlantic. The ballroom still feels like dancing under an open sky. But the house serves a different purpose now. What was built as a private stage for one woman's ambitions has become a public museum visited by tens of thousands of people each year. Visitors walk through the entrance hall where Tessie once greeted her guests. They climb the grand staircase where women in ball gowns once descended. They stand in the ballroom where 400 people once waltzed under Robert Reed's painted sky. They wander through the garden court where champagne was once served at sunset. Tour guides tell Tessie's story. The silver baron's daughter who built a palace to buy acceptance, the hostess who threw legendary parties, the woman who spent a fortune trying to prove she belonged. It's a story that resonates because it reveals something universal about ambition, insecurity, and the cost of perfection. Rosecliff has also returned to its original purpose in a limited way. The Preservation Society rents the ballroom for weddings and private events. The rental fees, substantial but nowhere near what Tessie spent, help fund ongoing maintenance and preservation. Modern couples exchange vows in the same room where Tessie threw her white ball, connecting past and present in ways she never imagined. The house has also become a popular filming location. Its timeless elegance and well-preserved interiors make it perfect for period films. The Great Gatsby was filmed there in 1974, with Robert Redford and Mia Farrow dancing in the ballroom. True Lies used the space for a key scene in 1994. Amistad included exterior shots in 1997. Younger generations recognize Rosecliff not from history books, but from movies. The irony would not be lost on Tessie. She built Rosecliff to secure her place among America's social elite, a small exclusive group of families who jealously guarded their status. Today, the house is famous not because it was exclusive, but because it's accessible. Anyone with a ticket can walk through the rooms where only the most privileged once entered. Tessie's legacy is complicated. She was not a philanthropist like Carnegie or Rockefeller who built libraries and universities. She was not an artist like Isabella Stewart Gardner, who filled her palace with masterpieces and opened it as a museum. She was a hostess who threw parties that have been forgotten by everyone except historians. But the house remains, and the house tells a story that matters, about the price of beauty, the cost of acceptance, and the impossibility of buying what can only be earned. Rosecliff is a cautionary tale. Tessie spent her father's silver fortune, millions of dollars over 3 decades, trying to prove she belonged among families whose wealth came from different sources. She believed that beauty, taste, and lavish entertaining would earn her a permanent place in society. She was wrong. Society moved on. The Gilded Age ended. World War I changed everything. The parties stopped, the grand cottages fell silent, and Tessie died alone, unable to speak, unable to return to the ballroom where she had once reigned. But the house survived because people decided it was worth saving, not because Tessie had been a great hostess, but because Stanford White had been a great architect. Not because the parties had been legendary, but because the building was beautiful. That's the real lesson of Rosecliff. Beauty can outlast the people who create it, but only if others choose to preserve it. Tessie built the house for herself, to prove her worth to a society that never fully accepted her. Today, the house belongs to everyone, a monument to one woman's ambition and a reminder that perfection comes at a price few can afford. The house stands, white and serene on Bellevue Avenue, waiting for visitors to walk through its rooms and imagine what it felt like to dance under a painted sky in the golden summer of 1904, when anything seemed possible and beauty felt like enough. Thank you for exploring the tragic and beautiful story of Rosecliff and Theresa Fair Oelrichs. If this investigation into Gilded Age ambition, the price of perfection, and the palaces built by new money fascinated you, please like this video and subscribe for more architectural deep dives. Tell me in the comments, which Newport mansion should we explore next? The Breakers and the Vanderbilt dynasty, Marble House and Alva's social revolution, the elms and the coal fortune that built it, or perhaps a forgotten estate with darker secrets buried in its walls? Your support and suggestions make these detailed documentaries possible. Until next time, remember that the grandest buildings always tell the most human stories, and that beauty, no matter how perfect, cannot buy what matters most.